Du Fu, on learning that our troops have retaken Henan and Hebei. The soldiers have retaken Hebei. Word has just come through Jiange Pass. As soon as I hear this, my robe is soaked with tears. I turn to look at my wife and children. Where did all our sorrow go? I pack up my poems, helter-skelter, so happy I'm witless. Broad day, and I am singing aloud. It's time for some wine. With green spring for company, what a joyful trip home. We'll go straight from Ba Gorge down through Wu Gorge, then on to Xiangyang, and home to Luoyang. So we continue with Du Fu's poems in the heptasyllabic meter. It's important to remember that the heptasyllabic meter was really popularized for regulated poems by Du Fu himself. Before his time, this form had been felt, just too formal, too artificial, too effete, and it had only been used for some rather conventional courtly poetry. It's Du Fu the one who really makes it feel alive, and his great technical mastery, which is evident in his ability in making parallelistic couplets with 7 parallelistic words, is shown in poems like these and all the other ones that are included in this section. So what's the topic of this poem? So as opposed to many poems that we have been reading, which are, social courtesies or poems on rather universal and conventional topics, this is, and Du Fu has a lot of poems like this, this is a poem about contemporary events, more specifically about contemporary political events. We've talked many times about the Lushan Rebellion, which started in 755. It was a major catastrophe for China and for the Tang Dynasty, and for Du Fu personally. And this is much, much later. So the Lushan Rebellion lasted for about 7 years. So this is towards the end of the Lushan Rebellion. In the year, I think, 763, the government forces managed to reconquer the second capital, Luoyang, the eastern capital. The western capital had been recovered pretty early on, I think in 757, 758. The east capital, which had become the capital of the usurpers, took much longer to recover, and the recovery wasn't that auspicious either, because the Tang dynasty had allied itself with the Uyghurs, and they thoroughly sacked the eastern capital, Luoyang, when they took it. But anyway, the capture of Luoyang and the death of the pretending emperor of the rebels put an official end to the Lushan Rebellion. Of course, the real situation was rather more complicated than this. The Chinese government was exhausted, and it wasn't really able to completely defeat the rebels in the east. In fact, most of those rebels who surrendered were allowed to retain the government of the provinces, of the military regions in the east and north of China, and they became, in all but name, independent rulers. And for most of the remaining Tang dynasty, those territories fell forever beyond the pale of the central government. The north of China was also massively devastated. Warfare had, burnt and raged through the heartland of the Yellow River Valley, including the 2 capitals. And the Chinese government and the Tang dynasty was left in a very weakened state. But anyway, Du Fu was, relatively right in being happy at receiving the news of the recovery of the Eastern Territories, at least of the capitals and the main part of the Eastern Territories, as he believed this would bring in an era of peace and imperial restoration, and also perhaps of private well-being. One of Du Fu's signature trademark elements in his poetry is the mix of personal and national plight. And in this case, we've got the reverse. We've got a personal and a national happiness. Of course, again, Du Fu was probably overtly optimistic. He would not be able to return to Luoyang, as he expresses in this poem, and the country would still be, weakened, and the imperial power laid low for many years to come. So I imagine this is a poem of the type that make Du Fu very popular among later and including contemporary Chinese readers, because it's a nationalist poem of exultation at the defeat of the rebellion. Remember, many of the troops that had been massed by the rebels in the Anlushan rebellion were semi-barbarian troops of the northeast, not all of them 100% Chinese. The leader of the rebellion, in fact, had been a Parthian, Anlushan. Okay, so let's go to the poem. So the title first, the title mentions the recovery of Henan and Hebei. Those are current provinces of China. The use here is a bit more generic. So Henan is the area south of the Yellow River Valley, which mostly would include the modern area of the province of Henan, but also parts of Shandong. Hebei refers to the area north of the Yellow River, and it would include the area of the capital of current-day Beijing, and the area of modern-day Hebei, but also other territories in Shandong and in the north. So, as usual, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. The soldiers have retaken Hebei. Word has just come through Jiange Pass. As soon as I heard this, my robe is soaked with tears. So the first couplet, as usual, introduces us to the poem. Where is Du Fu? Du Fu is still in Shu at this moment. If you will remember, he spent some years in the region of Shu, in the capital area, in Chengdu. But at this time, his protector had been sent away from the province, and there was some inner turmoil in the territory, and Du Fu was now living outside of Chengdu, but still in Shu. And he has received news. Hebei has been taken by the government forces. Word has just come through Jiange Pass. Jiange Pass, which could be translated as Sword Gate Pass, is a very important mountain pass that leads from the area of the capital into Shu. And it was a very difficult to cross path and a very mountain pass and a very famous one. In fact, there is a poem by Emperor Xuanzong in the Anlushan Rebellion when he was running away from the barbarians. He crossed this path, this mountain pass. Years later, he would recross it again, and he wrote a very famous poem about this, which is not included in this anthology, but is in the poems from the masters. So it's a landmark, this Swordgate Pass, but it represents very well the idea that into our protected area of Shu, news have just arrived. News have come from the passes. The east and the north of the country has been retaken and freed. And of course, the emotional reaction of Du Fu is only to be expected. Tears of joy fall from his face. He is ecstatic. And the next two couplets or so are going to describe this excitement, this happiness, and the plans that are made as a consequence by Du Fu. Second couplet. I turn to look at my wife and children. Where did all our sorrow go? I pack up my poems helter-skelter, so happy I'm witless. So the happiness, the intense emotion of the poet is detailed in the second couplet. So first he directs himself to his family, and they're all happy, they're all joyful, and all the sufferings and miseries that they've had to suffer for the war seem to have evaporated. And Du Fu wants to leave quickly back for the heartland, for the eastern heartland. We will explain why he is so keen on going to Luoyang in a moment. But, he packs up willy-nilly in a haphazard, chaotic way all the poems that he's been writing, all the books that he has been reading. He packs them up quickly because he wants to leave quickly. Third couplet. Broad day and I'm singing aloud. It's time for some wine. With green spring for company, what a joyful trip home. So why is he packing up so quickly? He wants to go somewhere. He is packing. First he is celebrating. The first line of the third couplet puts us image of celebration that looks slightly out of time or place. But then again, this is a special circumstance. So it's broad day, so it's not a time for partying and drinking, but Du Fu is singing and he thinks it's time for some wine, as if this was a nighttime party. But it's celebration time, evidently. With green spring for company, what a joyful trip home. Du Fu is going to go home, and it's spring, so this parallelism or correlation between seasonal flourishing and human or individual flourishing is very typical of Chinese poetry, sometimes to emphasize the contrast between the cycles of nature and what nature seems to be asking and what society seems to be doing, In this time, there is a harmony. It's spring, the time of renewal, of beauty, of rebirth, and it's also the time of returning home and rebirth and renewal for the Tang Dynasty, perhaps, and for Du Fu. Finally, the last couplet gives us some more details about where Du Fu is going to go to and the route he is intending to take. We'll go straight from Ba Gorge down through Wu Gorge, then on to Xiangyang, and home to Luoyang. So you will remember, after the Alishan Rebellion, for a couple of years or so, Du Fu did serve in the central government after he had managed to escape from the capital that was being held by the barbarians and the rebels. He served under Emperor Suzong, but very briefly in the chancellery because of different reasons that are not completely 100% clear now. Some say he was too outspoken as a counselor, others would say that his protectors, his patrons, were demoted and he was a collateral damage of this. Anyway, for whatever reason, Du Fu had been thrown out of office around 758. And then he had wandered through different areas, settled in Shu for a bit. His health was deteriorating. He was sad at being frustrated and a failure, a self-perceived failure as a Confucian scholar official. And again, his health was bad, his family was far away. Now this glad note seems to revive his aspirations, and he decides to go home. Now, where is home for Du Fu? Home would have been Luoyang, which was the place where his clan, the Tu clan, had lived. And it seems it was a place where Du Fu had his brothers and half-brothers living there, and he even had some plots of land in the region around the eastern capital. So he's intent on going home, and home for him is Luoyang. He's quite far away from Luoyang. I imagine the distance between Sichuan and Luoyang, especially through the southern route that he intends to follow here, is no smaller perhaps than the distance from, let's say, Lisbon to Copenhagen, if not more, if not to Sweden. So how is he going to go home? He's not intending to go home through the capital, the western capital, and the land within the passes. He's in Shu, so he intends to go down the river. The Yangtze, the great southern river of China, is born somewhere in the whereabouts of the mountains of Shu or Tibet. It flows down through a series of gorges, and then it flows east. So Du Fu is imagining this trip. In fact, he will go down with his family down the Yangtze, although I believe he never managed to reach Luoyang again. He continued the rest of his life as a wanderer through the Yangtze, living most of his time in a boat and dying in such circumstances. So, but that's still far away from Du Fu now. He doesn't know his future, we do. So he imagines himself going down these gorges, Wu Gorge, Ba Gorge, different gorges of the Yangtze River, and then on to Xiangyang, which would have been probably an important city in the area, I think, between the Yangtze and the Yellow River, and back to Luoyang. So this last mirage-like image of the city that he considers home is the place that one can go to now that the city has been recovered and now that peace seems to have arrived. Of course, we know better, as I said, we know history. Du Fu didn't manage to get back to his home, and what is worse, the country didn't manage to recover that well after the Andushan Rebellion. You will remember, readers of The Lord of the Rings, at the end that Frodo knows that he cannot go back to the Shire because you change. When you change after war, after chaos, and when the land changes, there is no going back home. Home disappears. You might have fought for an ideal. You might have hoped to, after victory, return back and enjoy the fruits of peace and somehow go back in time and, not only back in place, but go back to the situation of relative happiness before crisis and war took out. But that cannot happen. Humans are creatures that live in time and that live through change and that suffer the pains, the slings and arrows of inconstant fortune, of war, of chaos. Du Fu is hurt. China is hurt. There is no going back. But in the lighty, celebratory happiness of this poem, one can wish, along with Du Fu, that everything can be fixed, that all the wounds can be healed, and that everything can be restored as it was in the Golden Age.